Bing. Oh, wait a bit. Also start that. Oh, come on. Oh, also stop transcribing. That's okay. Take notes. Okay, that's all good. Right, it's doing the right thing. Sorry. Welcome to the CEFACT Global Trust Registry project. One thing, we are recording this session. There will be a transcript of minutes generated, and any chat messages are welcome, gratefully received, and will be recorded. Nothing will be used against you, I promise. It does, I note, have enormous difficulty in spelling CEFACT. In yesterday's meeting, I tried to spell it out in letters, the letter U, letter N /CEFACT. And despite that, the AI engine still managed to misspell it, often with the words unfact, which I find a very amusing way of spelling CEFACT. So welcome to the Unfact Global Trust Registry project. And that should have confused the AI sufficiently for me to move on. You all know this story, but we'll repeat it for the record. Code of conducts are effectively be nice to each other, but there is actually a formal code of conduct for CEFACT projects. And we have an intellectual property rights policy, which is basically that work we do for the CEFACT body is like an open source contribution, royalty-free for use for all. The agenda today, we don't have Alina with us. We had Alina with me 17 hours ago when we were doing the previous meeting, or 16 hours ago, because I'm an hour earlier. But she had some updates, which I'll include as best I can into this discussion, which aren't on this agenda, but she's in Geneva right now at another conference, a sort of World Trade Conference in Geneva. And so she had some feedback from discussions she had on day one. She's heading into, we'll have gone into day two yesterday, today, I don't know. Yes, I guess overnight for me, and we'll be going to day three before she leaves from Geneva. We'll talk about quickly 2 weeks ago, kind of what the findings were, where we were up to with the pilots discussion, and then we'll go into the guts of today, authoritative registry, and how we might operate and maintain and govern such a thing if it exists. Actually, I'll do the Alina update now. So Alina's at this World Trade conference, and she's obviously talking this project and other UNTP projects with parties. And it turns out there's, as you might expect, quite a lot of shared interests in those conferences. So she's bringing together a number of kind of connections into that. You'll see the details in the minutes of yesterday's meeting that are already published on the project drive, so you all have access to the meetings folder, recordings, and the transcript meeting, and so on. What I found with the transcript and then the meeting notes is that the meeting notes are kind of corrected by AI. The transcript has kind of all sorts of typos and other weirdness in it. What it seems to be doing is sort of processing that, making sense of that, and then producing minutes that actually look quite good, bar a couple of typos that I try and fix before I paste them. But they're up and running, so you can see the detail of what Alina was talking to. 2 weeks ago, we were talking about pilots, and we were talking about the idea, well, actually the reality, that we're going to be running a few pilots in this project. The idea 2 weeks ago, and it's still the idea, is that we are very open to people proposing use cases, the benefits that they see that might accrue from these pilots and from the project itself, as well as volunteering themselves. So we had 3 slides, if you remember, where we were posting or pasting the results. So this is one of those slides. This is actually kind of like a live feed from the form. So if people were to add another suggestion after Mark Lazar, then that would arrive in the slide, because it's sort of an auto update kind of thing. So we've got people feeding in ideas and benefits on the use cases. So the test pilot volunteers, there's these people here, and use case ideas of these use cases. A couple of quick comments on this. Marcus Allende is looking at a South American use case. He's got a number of bodies of work that he's doing with South American governments. So he's proposing a sort of South American approach. Harman van der Kooi is based in the Netherlands, and in fact their work has been with the Dutch Ministry of Commerce, with the business registry for the Netherlands. So what isn't stated in here, but he asked me to update that comment, is that is their work. So they're working with a registrar, an authoritative registrar in their work. So he's responsible for a group called FIDES, F-I-D-E-S, FIDES and FIDES Lab, all available on the web to have a look at what they do. He's a welcome new addition to our team. Hopefully it doesn't give you a headache, but I'm going backwards very quickly to get back to there again. So those slides are there, so very welcome to keep adding to it. We will keep working on it. We've basically got interest now from Canada, Spain, India, and South America, and I guess I should include the Netherlands, given Herman's sort of update to me. I'm, of course, trying to get Australia interested, and there are little sort of encouraging buds maybe on the eucalyptus trees or the wisteria, whatever it is. That's not wisteria, the Australian flowers, but are coming out. Well, we'll see if we can get them. But carry on adding more if you wish to. I want to talk today and listen actually to you guys giving me ideas on governance and operation for this thing. I've been following a kind of like a rough map of what we're talking to each of these 2 weeks, and the idea I had was that there's a logical model, which is this sort of basic diagram behind this slide here, which shows sort of a 4 separate jurisdictions in which parties are trading across, and that's the sort of basic idea of the schematic. And each of those jurisdictions has authoritative registrars for those participants, so land registrars, business registrars, whatever else. And those authoritative registrars have decided to interact with the UN CEFACT authoritative registrar directory, or card, as I like to try and remember to call it. So what we've been doing the last few weeks is kind of moving our way around the deliverables that seem to be necessary to have a sensible idea around cards. So this time we're talking about governance, which is the central body of this colorful wheel representation. The frame of mind that I was encouraging in the meeting 16 hours ago, and I've encouraged for this meeting, is the idea of a pre-parade. And the idea of that is that you imagine you've had a very successful project. It's gone brilliantly well. Everyone's celebrating, clapping each other on the back. There are ticker tapes flying from windows of streets. It's no longer happens, of course. That my mindset is to encourage us to think about what would need to be true for that to have happened. What would we need to have done? What kind of things are important if we're going to be successful? So the opposite of this, the antithesis of a pre-parade, is a pre-mortem, where you imagine it's all gone completely wrong, and then what you start flushing out are the risks, if you like. But at the moment, let's go pre-parade. Let's think of positives, and how might we have ensured success? What do we need to do to ensure success? The idea I had is to look at a couple of examples of existing systems that are similar, and there's lots of systems that are quite similar to the idea that we're promoting here. So UN CEFACT itself has a whole list of what they call a code list, so a list of codes, and those codes include from other bodies. So I've listed people like UN CEFACT low code we'll look at in detail. ICAO's PKD, ICAO is another UN agency. We'll talk to the PKD of ICAO. But there are others: the World Intellectual Property Office, IMF, GSMA, IATA, and others. There's lots of lists maintained by lots of organizations. I want to talk about ICAO PKD first. And those sort of colorful little diagrams on this slide are representative of the argument that ICAO themselves present for PKD. And their argument centers around the idea that if you imagine that PKD doesn't exist, and you want people to sort of work out whether they trust each other's e-passport process, then you have to have a kind of bilateral approach to this. And their argument is that if you have even just 8 countries, you end up with 56 different connections to kind of negotiate and maintain across the whole set of 8. And if you take that maths up to 100, you end up with 4,950. And that's an obvious, most of us who work in computers know that sort of formula fairly well. And their argument, therefore, is that it's simpler if you just have a centralized place that everybody can put their public key to, and therefore read the public keys of other countries, such that you can then do a machine reading of an e-passport as it approaches a gate being held by a person. And that's what enables us all, if we travel frequently with our passports, to go through the kind of e-passport gates. So it's a good thing, I think. I've got a kind of snapshot of some of the key things about it. ICAO is a UN agency based in Montreal. PKD isn't the only thing they do, by the way, the public key directory. They do a bunch of other things. It's established in 2007. It has a kind of robust governance structure. We'll look at that on the next slide, with a sort of structured approach to how they run themselves. It's self-sustaining. It charges a fee. You'll see that I think later on the fee is actually quite low. and not that they should be any higher, but it's remarkably good value, I suppose is what I'm saying. But what's interesting also about ICAO is they're looking at growing their kind of model into more things to be trusted beyond just the passport key. So already they've already explored into and developed health credential kind of concepts. Back in the day of COVID, they were very active in a way of thinking about how can passengers fly with proof of COVID vaccination, such that they could have an easier pass through on arrival and so on. So a bunch of ideas that ICAO are thinking about how to add to this sort of idea, this centralized directory. This is their operating governance sort of model. So it's if I use the cursor, I think it does. So the ICAO Council is basically a UN agency. You can sort of see it in the UN organization structure. The dotted line represents the kind of area that's really the PKD kind of thing. Inside the dotted line, I've drawn the sort of PKD participants. Those are countries. 107 countries currently participate. The process of getting the board together is a process of nomination from active participants in PKD. They nominate who they would like to be on the board. There's a process of determination by the council and eventually approval. You end up with 15 board members and the chair. That board has established an executive body, which again has a number of members of the board in it, but also some advisors from the secretariat and some other sort of functions, including the operator of the system itself, and an ISA representative. Periodically, they need to renew or go out to tender for a new operator. So this is an outsourced operation for PKD. I believe the current operator is Viridos. I was just checking that yesterday, but I haven't got the final confirmation. But I think that's the current operator for PKD. That contract is sort of on a service level agreement and so on, and it's renewed periodically when the contract needs to be renewed, or it's gone out to tender again. It needs to go out to tender. So fairly simple in some respects about how it works. I should probably go back and explain a little bit about the actual process of updating the list of keys. So here's a couple of things to talk to here. The MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, that's the fundamental agreement that a participant, a country makes with the PKD about how they will collaborate with PKD, what they will do. It's only 12 pages long. I'll find that wonderfully brief. And it's not exactly even text dense, right? So they don't need to say a lot to achieve a lot with the MOU. There are procedural documents, but there's only again about 4 or 5 of those, and they're not onerous, difficult to read. So I applaud the simplicity, I guess, of what they've done here in terms of describing what they need to do. And that's a good thing. And the way that the actual operation works is there's basically a submission of a public key that's being used by the country of origin for its passport signatures on the NFC chips inside your passport. And obviously those countries will rotate keys. They might revoke keys if they feel they've been corrupted in some way or other, or misused. They'll kind of revoke them. They have a revocation list. So they maintain a couple of kind of core things. One is their current public key list, so that you can sort of download and see, and also the history of keys. They also can maintain a revocation list. So if there are passports that have been revoked for whatever reason, there's a kind of list to read down. So those are really important, and there's a process by which those are provided by the participants through to the system. And it's a kind of 24/7 available download kind of thing. Every 24 hours, there's an update to the system. If not before, if there's an event, it can be more frequent. The fees are pretty low, I think. So for a country to want to register, it's $15,900 US, and the annual fee turns out to be at the moment around about $20,000 US a year. That fee goes down as you get more participants. 107, for those who want to think about it, is about half the countries of the world. One of the conversations last night was why only half? And there are a few obvious answers to that. One is not every country actually has an e-passport system. So there's quite a few countries that don't have that sophistication yet. There are a few countries that probably are either sanctioned by the UN. There's only 1 or 2 of those, or deliberately don't want to participate, but that's actually very small. I think the most of the other countries I think it's 198 or so, are not participating, not because they don't want to, because they're not ready yet. They don't have the facility. Countries like Tuvalu, Vanuatu, Pacific Island nations that are relatively near me would probably not have the infrastructure for this. Any questions on ICAO? Okay, cool. Yeah, by all means, ask anything. I may not know the answers, but I'll do my best. There is a 40-odd page deep research piece that we created that there was a link for about ICAO's PKD. UN CEFACT low code is an interesting contrast, somewhat similar, but has a somewhat different trajectory at the moment. So it's this 5 alpha, I think it's mostly alpha, maybe alphanumeric string that identifies locations in the world predominantly for shipping, not just for shipping, but predominantly for shipping. 103,000 locations are currently managed. They're managed in a similar fashion by sort of country basis. So countries are responsible for maintaining things. They've over the last few years had to add in more sophisticated models of updating and more participants for updating, because the actual updating process was becoming onerous within the UN CEFACT group itself. The granularity is pretty coarse, if you like, the number of things that they actually have locations for. So for Melbourne, for example, there's a code for Melbourne, which is AU-MEL, but that's only the code for the Port of Melbourne. There's no low code for the Melbourne Airport. But there are codes for Melbourne Airport through IATA and through ICAO, and they're different codes. But so if you think about shipping a parcel from one part of the world to another, if it's going to Melbourne Airport, you can't use a low code. But if you're shipping something, you've got a thank you, Paul. You've got to ship it through a to an ICAO or an IATA address. There are some interesting issues that are. I was concerned when I was presenting this last night, in case I was offending anybody from low code, but actually they've gone. It's actually public information. So the last plenary meeting for low code was in July of this year in Geneva. There's meeting minutes that are available. I'll show you a link in a second. And they discussed the dilemma they're facing about needing more resources and more funding and more stable IT infrastructure and so on. It's free. Low code is free to download and to actually use, and it's also free to recommend or request updates to. It doesn't have any sophisticated API models or anything else to download it. You download it as a CSV file, a Microsoft Access Database MDB file, or a text file. And that's actually explained in this chart here. This is pretty well how it sort of hangs together as best as I could understand. And that's a comment, I suppose. It's not as easy to understand how low code works as it is easy to understand how ICAO's PKD works. Low code was originally recommended. Recommendation number 16 from UN CEFACT is for low code. It's been updated since it was first recommended, but that was its origin. If you want a point of reference, the most recent recommendation was 49, and that was in July of this year. That was the one that led to UNTP, United Nations Transparency Protocol. The UNECE, the European part of the United Nations, is the commission that's responsible for UN CEFACT, and that's the body that has this low code and list of codes things. The process is one where we've got data management requests through a web portal where anybody can kind of submit these, and then they're processed by a kind of little army of people trying to work out how to handle them. Some of them are the national focal points; those are for countries. There are institutional focal points like IATA and others, and there's an actual maintenance team for UN low code itself. And there's the secretariat of the UNECE, which are the sort of full-time employees of UNECE that also have a role in checking it out. And they go through a process of deciding what updates to put through, and they put them through into the list once every 6 months. And that's, if you understand me saying it in those ways, not that often. And the other interesting thing is that in the document I'll show you in a second, they're actually saying we may not be able to afford it to do it every 6 months. It might have to be every year. And that's, a very slow rate of update. The formats you can download are Access databases, CSV files, and text formats. And that's probably the most that you can sort of say about it. The things that are positive, it's freely available. You can send update requests for free. Participation is free in every sense of that word. And there's lots of things that are built in it. It's actually quite an important a system, if you like, in place for trade globally. But it's got gaps, and it's got holes, and it's got parts that are less accurate than others, and that's created an opportunity maybe for a commercial ecosystem around the outside of companies that kind of offer you corrected low code values, or more frequent updates to things, or more frequent sort of alerts to changes, or so on, such that you can perhaps rely on them more, and you can access them through an API, so you don't need to download a Microsoft Access database or whatever else. And so there's a whole little ecosystem around the outside of low code. But the problem that they recognize themselves is this idea that they need to be sustainable, and at the moment it's kind of not. So if I click that, I think it will open. Yeah, it's going to open. Yeah, cool. So if I now zoom in a bit, just to show you the bit that this is the summary here from this note, and so it's sort of it's telling us that, you know, that it has continued relevance. That there's a lack of dedicated resources and need for modernization. And this is a note from July 25, sorry, for this year's plenary. So low code's in an interesting space right now, and they need to sort of work out what their future is. So a few observations. These were Alina's slides, and you have the pleasure of listening to Alina's voice now. She was online, but she was doing these ones yesterday. Where we're at on this is early observations. We'll take the best that we can find from both of these systems, and they're kind of complementary in some respects, and there are other systems to learn from too. For example, Trust over IP has a meta governance model for general purpose release of verifiable credentials of any form that's being used in a number of places, including VLI and C2PA, for example, recently. We took note of this idea of technical operations being kind of internal UN procured, so you can go outsource and have a contract. It needs to be anchored to a particular body, and you'll see later we are not necessarily going to dictate it should be this body or another. It's not probably our gift. It should be anchored to a UN body that makes sense, up to the UN to decide which that is. It should be simple, principle-based, technology-neutral governance text as best we can write it. Minimal cost, maximal value, these sort of things. And Alina came up with a really good list, I think, of sort of the principles about the governance. So it's going to have a UN anchoring a mandate, we think. But you know, that's, in a sense, it's sort of a question: is the UN the right body to look after this? We think the answer to that is yes, it's the right body. But obviously, we're still willing to open to listening to other suggestions. There needs to be some sort of separation of roles around how things work to make governance actually a genuine governance and operation separate from governance and so on. It needs to have inclusivity and representation. An example that Alina drew yesterday is not all countries are equally digitally mature. So some may not have actually started releasing any form of digital access to data of registered companies, say. But nevertheless, they have a legal basis for registration. They have a authority that does this work, that's recognized in their legal system, that is given authority by the government and so on. So they meet all the requirements you might have for are you the authoritative registrar? They just don't publish digital records that are, well, digital records in the sense of verifiable credentials or other forms of easily accessible proof. But I think they should still be in the list. Because if you're seeing a shipment bill from a company claiming to be from a country that has that system, you'll want to know that it was the authoritative registrar, as best you can tell, that issued those claims to that company. So even if they're not digitally kind of all powerful, they still probably should be logged in. That's part of that inclusivity and representation, and goes to our minimum requirements kind of concept for registration in the directory. A couple of other things we're both picking up in the sustainability and affordability concept. Alina picked up on a good point as well about interoperability and change management. So open standards and version control, whatever technology we would choose right now won't be the technology we would choose in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. So inevitably, you're going to have to anticipate a change. And that goes to things like fee structures and so on, because what you need to be able to think about is that your fees not only pay for your current operation, but give you sufficient sort of spare to either constantly replace and update your current operation, or to set aside the money to do a step change every now and then when you need to do a step change, or you task your supplier with ensuring that the technology they're running on is current and up to date. There's a number of ways of addressing it, but you have to think about paying enough to accommodate the future. And there's a whole bunch of other things. Oh, Anne, go ahead.
I have a question, so I'm sorry if it has been addressed before, but basically what we're trying to establish is that what is it this organizations we're thinking that govern? Basically, we govern the registries for member states and accept whatever practice it is that they're doing or whatever standards that they are currently having. This body would not dictate that. It just basically saying, say, if you say take the case of Canada, that would be registries of business, there is land registries, and this new body would govern or acknowledge these registries from Canada. And as long as a business say that they have registered themselves in the business registry of Canada, following the standards, then that's whatever that is, as long as okay.
Yeah, exactly right. And there was in the earlier parts of these discussions, we put forward the idea that it is not for this project or this system, if it becomes a system, to dictate to countries how to do their thing, right? That they choose how to register, they choose how to run their systems, what legal basis. What we want to do is record what that system is, and the way we want to record it is they tell us. A bit like the UK or PKD. It's like Canada tells us, okay, we register businesses in the following way. These are the registrars. These are the processes they use. This is the law upon which this is based, pointer to some legislation. And these are the public kind of artifacts that we generate, the presentation format that we use or whatever for the registration. So what we want to have is this flexibility that says it's up to you what you do. We have a kind of minimum expectation that if you're not actually a nation state authoritative registrar, then you're probably not in this list, because that's what we're looking to list. And if you don't have a legal basis for the registration of things, if there's no sort of coherent fabric of legal basis, then we probably can't list you, because it's not certain exactly what it means if you've registered something. There's a few minimal requirements. Basically, you're right. It's not for us to say how they do it. What we're trying to decide is how we should run our own thing, right? Given that how does the UN run this thing that registers people's interest in being enlisted in the directory and so on? So how does it do its work?
And then, so on the practical level, on the implementation level, that would be a place where you can look up just the registries, but not the actual unique. And for example,
not the data. Exactly. I don't want the data, because if we get there will be God knows how much data if you try to so exactly right.
The links that lead us to the registries itself. For example, if I'm saying I'm a Canadian business, and then I would be able to go on here and say, here's a basically quote unquote link to the business registration in Canada, where I can look up and verify that this is indeed the correct one. So Lena brought up a really good point about countries that do not fully digitalized, or even they just partially. So we
for them we record what do you do. Let's write that down at least. Maybe you produce a PDF, and maybe the PDF is signed. Whatever it is they do something. The other sort of idea that we have at the moment is that there's a kind of maturity process of this thing. We want to sort of do the classic kind of crawl, walk, run thing, right? So first of all, register things. Secondly, if countries are issuing digital credentials of some form or other, there's every opportunity to start thinking in terms of that sort of PKD system where you record the public key they've got currently. Because what you then are enabling is this idea that if you that country registrar had issued a credential to this company claiming to be registered by you, then your signature would be on their credential. So where's the public key that I can find that has that I can then check against the thing you've signed? And it's possible to imagine that if there's sufficient interest and volume of work and so on, that this directory includes things like the public keys of issuing registrars. But that's a sort of future case. It doesn't need to be the first case. Paul.
Jai, in terms of at the UN level, and the trade case is so interesting because you don't necessarily know who's going to be in a trade transaction in terms of organizations. It can be anywhere. Yep. But are you envisaging the UN registry potentially issuing keys that then get bound on
so
the
yes,
registry?
you're already on the next level. Yeah. So if we imagine that we've got I think it's 3 steps in this in my mind that we're talking about right now. The first is we just record what they do. And they tell us what they do. We just write it down in some sort of text form or some other accessible form, whatever that you can machine read if possible. But anyway, we record what people do. The next is because they are assigning things digitally, we actually record the keys they're using. We allow that to be rotated, and that's sort of another level of usefulness. The third level you've just described, I think, Paul, is this idea that says we can give them back something that says we recognize you. You're recognized by UN CEFACT's authoritative registry directory. Here's our certificate back to you to say we recognize you, and then you can put that, if you like, in the things you're signing, and now we've got this wonderful sort of self-authenticating kind of record that when the relying party receives and go, oh, I can see not only is it signed by the issuer, the company, they've been given an identifier by the authoritative registrar of Spain, and that authoritative registrar is in fact recognized by the UN as the authoritative registrar of Spain because there's their signature too. So yes, you can imagine this sort of multi-sig kind of process that gives as best confidence as you can that this is indeed the party they claim to be. But those don't all need to happen at once. One of the things I'm concerned about is not to kind of try and boil an ocean here and go, whoa, we've got all this possible, let's go for the big possible, then everyone, it will just be like a choking process. So I just want to go kind of one step at a time, knowing that that's the future possible. Because there's going to be enough challenges to even get the first bit up, probably.
Yeah. I mean, I think my observation from some of the, if you go to the AMVA stuff with the MDocs or the MDLs, and then even with the Australian government digital ID, process, to give some idea of the onboarding in the Australian context, just to become a relying party, which I've got personal experience in. The governance process meant that the governance and assurance process of onboarding took about 18 months.
Yeah.
The technical implementation took 24 hours.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things, and if I reflect on, I think when they talked about in Australia, the Ausroads, they literally flew someone to the US to pick up the key to bring it back.
Yeah.
And it was physical transference of the key.
Yeah, that's part of the PKD. If you read the PKD, sort of, they have a genuine. The word ceremony belongs well with the process they follow. There's a key ceremony, and people are meant to, in fact, arrive and do things in person. And that's also echoed by processes like the VLI thing. If your organization gets a verifiable legal entity identifier, the process of getting such a thing is quite a ceremony. There's sort of a number of parties need to be in a room together. They kind of create a kind of sharding and multi-key thingy, and it's quite a thing, such that you can now from now on rely upon the origin of that particular key structure. So yes, you're right. The tech actually in some ways is relatively simple, but the process around it is quite ornate.
And the reason I bring that up is that I think that's got a scale problem, depending on how you look at it.
That's why. So I think there's so in that PKD thing, which I keep liking, right? Is there's this idea of being there's almost like tiers of membership. There's like a registration process. There's an active process where you're an active participant and you're providing keys and doing things. And there's different levels. So we could imagine that to be listed in the directory and have your, I know, your web page and whatever else that's sort of referenceable that is perhaps reasonably simple. And then if you're going to get into the digital key stuff, then obviously you get much more ornate, to use the word I just used. It gets much more complicated. And so maybe we do a tiering approach that sort of encourages early adoption, get some early wins and some benefits, and then kind of offer the opportunity to add more value by doing the next steps. And that might be the way to sort of encourage adoption. But yeah, you're right. It's there in a sense, there should be no hiding cryptographic complexity, because it's important that you get those things right, because that's the fundamental basis of digital trust. So the complexity of a ceremony is actually kind of necessary. Otherwise, it doesn't mean much.
I mean, one of the things that came up in the EU recently, they're just in ETSI, I think I mentioned it to you, John, is that, they were talking about relying parties and how to onboard a relying party and what signature that relying party had to have. And again, it was, do they issue a certificate for each relying party in terms of organization, or what about multiple services within that organization, and how to revoke, because they wanted to be able to revoke a certificate for a service but not the organization. And so this is where the scaling, and I could sort of see, and so I could sort of see the same problem if you think about Australia and getting a certificate, and then registries getting a certificate, and then multiple services within a registry. You could see that scale problem happen quite quickly.
There's a number of I guess side effects of that explosion of detail, isn't there? The very challenge of revocation across so many different parts of places becomes an issue. There's a number of consequences that I guess the sanity check we're taking at the moment is we're going to start really quite coarse and quite simple. So we're narrowing our view to just supply chain stuff, because we're kind of in the UN CEFACT umbrella. So it's all about trade and commerce. Notwithstanding that this idea of obviously has impact possibly well outside of just trade and commerce. But the next thing to simplify is we'll go kind of course, I suppose, in terms of registration of, say, companies, and keep it at a sort of high level rather than a more micro level. We won't be dealing with the other minutiae of trade, like things like digital product passports and stuff. Those belong in the UNTP specification, and the handling of registration of products and stuff is handled by organizations like GS1 and others. And we kind of, we don't want to go there yet. That's not necessary. If we could, I guess I hold still to be true the idea that if we could provide a trustworthy list of the registrars, authoritative registrars in the world, the registered companies and land and other assets to do with trade, that would be useful. And that is a service that would be worth having. And then we can build on it. And what you highlighted actually is one of the challenges for us, and it's one of the things that Lena was talking to me about yesterday. We will face some resistance from Europe because of their existing investment in the IDAS. You might say sort of paradoxically, but because they're very busy sorting out the revocation list issues and other registration issues and trust list issues. So this will be, our approach will be risks being conflated, or a distraction from what they're doing, or confuse what they're doing, and we're doing our thing anyway. And our position will be, well, we're trying to do something for the world. Europe is a really important part of the world, but it's not the world, and it's not the same thing as you're trying to do. We're trying to do something different, and so we've got to be very clear about what we're trying to do, why it doesn't tread on toes, why it doesn't create a conflict of interests or anything else. And they can have their cake and they can eat it too. It's okay, right? They will no doubt solve their problem the way they want to solve it, and it shouldn't make any real substantial difference to what we want to do either. although we can learn from it maybe. And that's the idea, that if there are smarter ways to avoid the explosion of complexity, great, bring them on. Let's do that. So this is the list of questions that we ended up with yesterday, as a sort of final page of things, and it's the sort of start of questions, right? We think we know some of the answers to these questions, but we're still very much open-minded. Alina is writing up a kind of governance framework at the moment in a document form. Her legal training will make it, no doubt, feel very clause-like when you're reading it, but that's important. So she has a significant eye for detail, and so we're making sure we have reasonable answers to these types of questions. So does it make sense still for the UN to be the curator of CARD? We believe the answer to be yes, but we're open to suggestions as to why not. And in a sense, the why nots should be objections that we consider responses to. Is there a good response to that objection? Which body? We may not have an answer to that, but there are obvious ideas about the type of body it should be. How do you manage this sort of inclusivity and balance and so on? How do we want to operate? So if you sense from the PKD and low code examples, you can sort of, I think those give us a nice kind of contrast, both important services, one doing slightly better, shall we say, than the other. Both are essential. And I think that gives us an idea about what we need to be sure about, or about our recommendations, about this idea about sustainability. And perhaps you can't give it away for free. If I voice an obvious political fact at the moment, is that there aren't many countries who want to give more money to the UN right now. And therefore the UN has to be very much value-based in its proposition to the world, right? So what do I get for my investment? Let's make the investment as small as possible and the value return as big as possible, and therefore the promise sustainable. And that's where I think I'm going to. Yes, Paul, I think you're right. ICAO and ITU are the other two that sort of make sense. We've got a IATA as well, I suppose. It's worth having that list of alternatives and thinking about why not. One of the responses for me for ICAO is to remind myself that the expansion of ICAO is the International Civil Airline Organization, and in a sense that defines its area of interest. It isn't interested in shipping, right? It isn't interested in, I don't know, mining operations or whether or not land is being deforested. But we are, and therefore we have a sort of a different kind of span of interest. But there might be a nice idea about, does it need to be one body? Can you do some sort of dispersed sort of approach where you consolidate and make sure other parties are, is there some way to sort of decentralize this? Maybe there is. That's sort of possible. Anyway, that's how we ended up yesterday. You would have heard a lot more from Alina if you'd been on yesterday's call. We had about 20 people, I think, on the call yesterday. Basically, these decks, as ever, are open to you all to access and comment and provide suggestions. You've all, I think, got on the Groups.io email messaging platform. I made the folder of deliverables accessible to view to all. So one of the things I did yesterday was to show those deliverables. I'll do the same just now. Basically, the way the deliverable folder is working is project deliverables is like it's like any of the OneDrive, Dropbox, whatever. It's a list of come on, project deliverables. Oh, you're not opening for me. I have a very interesting problem with my mouse every now and then where it doesn't like double clicks. So I need to go through a very laborious process to open up there you go. Project deliverables. If you get this link here, I'll put it in the chat right now. All of you should be able to access this this folder without having to log in. And you should be able to see a list of deliverables of the documents. And you'll notice that they've got these sort of numbers are trying to honor that logical map thingy that I was showing you about kind of the areas of focus. What's probably going to happen is we'll probably consolidate these. Ultimately, we're going to be writing two fundamental types of document. One is a sort of recommendation about the central directory kind of concept. And the other is going to be sort of more detailed specifications or standards for the types of things, so data formats and structures, perhaps updates to the digital identity anchor specification itself, and a few other things might come out. So that there'll be sort of these two bodies. So it might end up, these 6 documents might end up being more consolidated by the time we write the final content. And that's it. That's all I have for you today. Any other final questions? Anything you want to say? Yes, Paul.
Just a quick one. I'm wondering, I'm just thinking out loud, there's probably 2 points of recognition in terms of that the UN could do is what's the jurisdiction in a registrar in a particular country. But to your point, there's probably also for international registers, what are the different industry registrars? So if you think like a KO's airline and what was the other one? I don't know,
Yeah.
let's say ITU might be telephone companies.
Yep.
You know, you might have actually 2 types of registry entries. One who's the international authority and who's the country registry.
And I think that's a really good point, Paul. And I think one of the ways to think about that is if we let's take ITU for the heck of it, right? So that's another. I think the ITU is a near UN or has a relationship with the UN, but we already know that KO is part of the UN sort of family, I suppose. Where I'm going to with this is the idea that should this be reliant upon the commercial interests of even of a non-profit of an entity that's not part of the UN in any way, really. If we rely upon the work of other bodies of the UN, that sort of is fine. It's sort of part of the family, and if they therefore they deal with countries as their unit of currency, that's the sort of way of working. But if we deal with organizations like LIFE, which are very worthy organizations, their unit of currency is not countries. Their unit of currency is companies, and they kind of build up from there, and they find out where those companies are registered. It turns out they're registered in a country, but their unit of currency is companies and the directors of those companies. So, and also we can't. LIFE is independent, if you like, of countries. Hasn't got any governance under the United Nations. So I think there's a sort of logical process that says yes, we could rely upon and use and do well to align ourselves with existing lists maintained by UN type agencies. But I think we probably can't easily rely upon non-UN type agencies because of the sort of the governance gap, if you like. You know, we don't have a sort of say over LIFE, nor should we. If they decide to drop countries of their choice, that's up to them, and we won't have any ability to say they shouldn't. So it's sort of I think that's the way I'm thinking about it right now. But I think it's a good idea to list those, as you did in the chat, those other parts that are worth thinking about because they already maintain lists that might actually give us a kind of quick start.
I mean, the UN does recognise other bodies. So in my context, which is sport, as you know, John,
Yep.
you know, they officially recognise bodies like International Olympic Committee.
Yes.
And then that cascades down recognition from there. So there's some interesting ones that I think you'll find some grey areas.
Well, if I've triggered your interest, Paul, please feel free to do a little bit of squirreling around and see what you think. Right? I'll obviously I value what you say, so send us a note or a thought about that. Sankashan in the chat has pointed out another important thing, which is that we'll no doubt need more conversations around what sort of economic model are we thinking of. I was thinking about that, and I agree with you, Sankashan. We won't have time today because I do want to honour the finish before the top of the hour thing. One way of thinking about that is that that number from ICAO is an interesting number. I mean, you can sort of do the maths quite simply. 107 times 20,000 gives you the rough annual kind of budget for ICAO PKD, and you can imagine how many full-time equivalent employees does that employ, or what sort of infrastructure does that buy? You can kind of do some sort of thinking around, is that sufficient? What kind of infrastructure and cost do we imagine we might need for this? I feel at the moment, to start with, it should be quite lightweight and not too costly. There doesn't feel like this needs mega tech. So I kind of feel but to your point, all the process, the bureaucracy around it might be quite significant. So you might need lots of people tech around the hard tech, right? So we'll see. But yeah, so you're right, Sankashan, we need to go back to the actual sort of economic and fee model and everything else. And you're right, Paul, we should be looking at the other agencies and so on, and what can we lean on.
If I could add, I think maybe the hardest part is to really draw a very clear scope of what we would include, because that would make the selection and what to include, what not to include in audits and verifications of the registrar not so much, not necessarily easier, but at least a guiding principles, right?
You're very right, Anne. We have a sort of eligibility requirements document that we've written that sort of talks to that. And has a fair amount of detail in it at the moment. And that I shared the link to in yesterday's meeting, but it's in that project delivery folder, so I think it's still probably available to me. So in here is a eligibility criteria for registrars, and that sort of gives an idea of what we're thinking about. But the other source of the scope answer is we, at the beginning of this sort of project, considered what are we interested in, and we sort of worked out a way of describing what we're interested in. Authoritative registrars from nation states, countries that are part of the UN, but there isn't a nation state country. Well, I guess North Korea isn't part of the UN, but the idea being that they're recognized bodies by the UN. They have a jurisdictional framework, a legal framework upon which their registrar operates, that you can kind of point to. You can see it's part of the government model. And those are sort of fundamental elements of are we interested? And the other filter is it to do with trade, right? So that gives us another gross simplification, if you like, that we're only interested in things that are to do with trade right now. And yes, in the future there may be lots of other stuff, but let's just focus on trade. And that gives us a sort of a reasonably good way of simplifying our starting point, I think. But we're very welcome to have a look at the eligibility criteria and comment to make suggestions.
Fantastic.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna quit now. I need to get to another event, and I'm sure you've all got either things to do or stop doing or whatever. So thank you very much, all of you. You'll see the minutes and the recording in probably a few hours. They'll come up. Thank you. I'll see you on the next call.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you very much.